All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Marjan. I am the Education and Learning Lead with Family Caregivers of BC. Before we get started, I just wanted to first respectfully acknowledge the Lekwungen peoples on whose unceded territories the FCBC office is located, as well as the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanek peoples whose longstanding relationship with this land continues to this day. I am currently joining in from the beautiful and unceded lands of the Coquitlam First Nations. And if you're comfortable, I welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know which land you're joining in from. Before we get started, I just want to give a little bit of information on Family Caregivers of BC. We are a nonprofit charity dedicated 100% to the well-being of family caregivers. Our mission is to improve the quality of life for family caregivers through support, through information and education. And we provide leadership to strengthen the voices of family caregivers and the significance of their role. So we probably support over 1 million people in British Columbia who provide physical and or emotional care to a family member, a partner, a friend, or a neighbor. And our three main pillars are caregiver support, education, and engagement and collaboration. So we have here today our guest presenter, Rebecca Pimienta, who is a social worker and the project coordinator for Caregiver Grief Connection. She holds a BSW and MSW from McGill University and has research experience in the fields of aging, dementia, and post-caregiving. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Marjan. I really appreciate, the Family Caregivers of BC has invited me to speak in this webinar, and I appreciate each of you today that has taken time out of your day to be here. I'm going to share my screen so that we can get started with the PowerPoint. And if there's any technical issues, Marjan, just please let me know. So Caregiver Grief Connection is the project that I work for. Like Marjan mentioned, I'm a social worker, first and foremost, and in this role, I'm the coordinator of Caregiver Grief Connection. And we're funded by the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, which is a program of the Azrieli Foundation. And some of our partners also include the McGill University School of Social Work, the CIUS du Centre-Ouest de l'Île de Montréal in Quebec, the CREGES Centre for Research and Expertise in Social Gerontology. Before we get started today, I just want to give a little disclaimer that this is content that is meant as education, and we really believe that knowledge is power when it comes to grief and caregiving. So we're going to be talking about caregiving, about grief, about death and dying, and this can be upsetting. It can also be a difficult topic. And if you feel at any point that it's too upsetting for you, feel free to take a break, to leave the webinar. It's going to be recorded, so you can always watch it later. But make sure that you're taking care of yourself in this moment if it's too challenging for you. And this is not medical advice, so if you are in a crisis, please do reach out to your local health services. So the plan for today is for I'll give you a quick introduction to Caregiver Grief Connection, and we want to give some information about grief that you may experience during the caregiving journey, but also after the death. And so that's what we call post-caregiving. Then we'll look at some support strategies and some resources before we do a quick conclusion, because we really think that a protective factor for caregivers is having an understanding of what grief is, and being educated about it. So by being here today, you're already taking a step in that direction. So, Caregiver Grief Connection, like I mentioned, was funded by the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence about 3.5 years ago. And the goals of our project are to increase recognition and support for grieving caregivers, and also to help equip health and social service workers, families, and friends, and really the entire community on how to support those grieving caregivers. Because we hear time and again, even from healthcare workers, that they just don't know what to say, and they just don't feel comfortable talking to the bereaved family members after the death of a person that was being cared for. So we are aiming to bring more attention to that, do a lot of trainings, education. This is part of the um, presentations that we offer. And we also do offer some supports directly to bereaved caregivers. For now, they are limited to the Montreal, Quebec area, but we are hoping to expand in the future. And we have a free online community of practice for professionals on different kinds of topics related to caregiver grief. So, before we get started going into grief that's specific to caregivers, we like to start with a basic definition of what our approach to grief is to make sure that we're all on the same page. And very, very basically, grief is a reaction to a loss. So it's a normal human response to a loss. There's no place in the world where you would go and not see that people grieve. Um, and it's also an adaptive coping strategy. Now, grief can be experienced in reaction to any kinds of loss. So it could be the loss of autonomy, a loss of a goal, a loss of a relationship, a loss of a job, a loss of an apartment. It could be any kinds of loss, not just death. So when it's actually specific to a death, we use the term bereavement. But grief can be related to any kind of loss. And grief has impacts across all physical, emotional, mental, cognitive, behavioral, spiritual, social, and cultural domains. So we'll get more into that in the coming slides, but grief really impacts us in many, many ways that we might not initially assume. The ways in which grief is experienced by each person and by each caregiver is different. And it also varies immensely across culture and context. I'll talk a little bit more about culture later on, but it's important for us to keep in mind the setting and context of each individually. One thing we want to emphasize is that grief is not a time-bound process that ends in detachment. We'll get a little bit more into myths and misconceptions soon, but we often assume that there's a specific path for grief, and this is how you go through it, and that at a certain point you're going to reach being healed and not ever grieving anymore. And that's not the case. So it's not a time-bound process, and also the impact of the loss cannot be predicted. So sometimes people think that the loss of a friend is going to be less impactful than the loss of a spouse or the loss of, a cousin or whichever relation you'll think of. But we can't really predict that because it is very much personalized to the specific individual, the care relationship, and all the factors that come into play. And I want to make a note that Canada is advancing slowly but surely in terms of grief knowledge and literacy. But recently, after the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a Canadian Grief Alliance that was formed, which is a collection of different organizations and players across Canada who formed this alliance called the Canadian Grief Alliance. They have a website called aboutgrief.ca. And they recently did a survey of almost 4,000 Canadians, and they asked them how they were supported during their bereavement experiences. And across the board, they really found that people are not well supported in grief, and that our communities and our healthcare workers and all of our systems majoritarily do not know how to respond to grieving individuals. And so they said that we're in a grief literacy crisis. And for us, our project, which is at the intersection of caregiving and grief, it's very important for us to bring awareness to both of these topics and also how the two of them come together to impact the lives of caregivers. So thank you for being here today to start learning about this. I like to share this slide on the different manifestations of grief it is a slide that there's a social worker here in the Teresa Deller Palliative Care residence in the West Island of Montreal who does this presentation. And I like to share it because it demonstrates some of the different manifestations of grief and how it impacts our bodies in many different ways. Um, because I think many people assume that grief means that they will be sad and that they will cry, and that's about it. They don't necessarily realize all the different impacts that grief can have. And in terms of physical impacts, sleep disturbances, shortness of breath, tightness in the throat, nausea, weight loss or gain, fatigue, aches and pains. Um, I'm not going to go through all of them, but even cognitively, grief can cause us to have memory problems, to be a little bit more anxious, to worry more, to be more preoccupied about certain topics, to have a feeling of confusion, to be clumsy even. And most of the times when we speak to bereaved caregivers, they say, I'm feeling this and this, and I don't know, there must be something wrong with me. I need to go do some medical tests. And while it could be good to do some medical tests, it's also important to consider that it could be the grief that is manifesting itself in different ways in your body and in your experience. So being aware that grief doesn't just come out in one particular way, and it's going to be different for everybody, is important for us, for yourself in knowing how do you cope with grief, but also for health and social service workers in helping to support the people that they work with. I've listed here a bunch of myths and misconceptions that we have heard, some from caregivers directly over the years, about grief. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them because we don't have the time, but I'll just cover some of the examples. Like your grief will decline over time. Bereavement is less painful when the death was expected. Grieving means letting go of the person who died. Once your loved one has died, it is better not to focus on him or her, but to put them in the past and go on with your life. Or it takes a set amount of time to get over your grief. Or even when grief is resolved, it never comes up again. Maybe you can write in the chat if you have heard of any other myths or if these are some that have been present in your circle. Now, the issue with these myths and misconceptions is that they can lead to unrealistic expectations around grief and bereavement, and they can make it harder for somebody to ask for help. So people might often think that, like in this image, that there are certain stages of grief. You might have heard about stages of grief that you have to go through one stage at a time, and that you'll go through them in order, and it'll be all perfectly nice, organized, and linear. Like you'll see in this image, right, going from shock, numbness, denial, anger, then to re-entry, hope, strength. It's nice and organized and linear. But in reality, many people tell us that their experience is much more like the experience on the right side, which, as you see, is very chaotic, very messy, and very much based in truth and in reality. Because grief and bereavement are unique, and there is no right way to grieve. The other thing to mention is that not everybody is going to need support in bereavement. So there's been some research in Australia. Australia is much more advanced than Canada is when it comes to grief research in general. And so they've done some research to see, in terms of a whole population, who is it that is going to require extra supports in their grief. And what they found is about 60% of the population, general bereaved people, not necessarily caregivers, are going to be able to cope with their grief with the existing supports that they already have from their families, their friends, their communities, their employment. They're going to be able to cope with the systems that are already in place in their personal lives. Then there's about 35% of people that will need a little bit extra support to get through the grieving process. So that's usually the kind of support that's like a peer support group in the community, like a community peer-to-peer network or a support group that's offered. And then there's really only about 6 to 7% of the general bereaved population who would be at potentially more of a risk for complicated grief and would need more specialized mental health services from a healthcare professional. Um, most of these ring true for caregivers as well, but there are certain factors that can make it more challenges for caregivers, and we will look at that soon. But on average, if a person is well supported in their community, in their society, grief is a normal part of life, and they will be able to make it through. So I'm going to talk now about a few different kinds of grief that you may experience during the caregiving journey itself as you're actively providing care for somebody. And please keep in mind that we could spend an entire webinar just talking about one of these concepts. We don't have time for that today, so I'm going to do a quick overview of the topics. But if you would like more information, there's plenty of information out there. So the first one is called anticipatory grief. And anticipatory grief essentially means that it's grief you are experiencing in anticipation of the death. It's a reaction and a response to all losses encountered in the past, present, or future or of a life-threatening illness. And it can begin at the sense of diagnosis, but most often it starts happening earlier when you see that there's changes in the person in your life. And the losses are both tangible and intangible. And what we hear from caregivers is that they'll say, I've started to think in my head about what it's going to be like when the person is gone. And then they might feel guilty about it, and there's all kinds of emotions that come with that. But it is a normal part of the human experiences when we begin to mourn the losses that we see happening. And we try to organize ourselves in our mind for how we're going to cope in advance. Now, the thing is, experiencing anticipatory grief doesn't necessarily mean that you will grieve your loved one any less after they are gone. So people might think, I'm already getting ready in my mind. I'm going to be ready. It's not going to be a shock. It very well still might be. And it comes down to the individual for that. There's one other quote I like to share. It's not on the slide, but I'll read it out. And it's from Teresa Rando as well. And it says, "A rehearsal is not the real thing. However, just because anticipatory grief is not exactly like post-death grief, which it never could be since the death has not yet transpired, does not mean it is not grief." And because this is a kind of grief that's not necessarily known, it can make it harder for people to say these things out loud, to express the kinds of grief that they're living. And the next type of grief that is often experienced by caregivers during their caregiving journey is called ambiguous loss. And this is a loss that is unclear. So it's when a death has not occurred, but a loss or a series of losses are impacting an individual or family. And Pauline Boss, who is the one who had kind of pioneered this topic, identified two different kinds of ambiguous loss. So the first one it's called leaving without goodbye, and it's when there is physical absence with psychological presence. So the person is physically absent. We don't see the person anymore, but they remain active in our minds. And this is often the case with a missing person. But the one that's more common usually for caregivers is goodbye without leaving. And that is when there's psychological absence with physical presence. And that's very common with cognitive impairments, traumatic brain injuries, stroke, and progressive illnesses like dementia. And I've heard from caregivers that they'll say something like, "My mom is here. Her body is here in front of me, but her mind is different. It's not her anymore. Her mind is gone." And this can be extremely challenging for caregivers, as you can imagine, because we live in a culture and a human nature that likes to solve problems. And when we can't solve problems, we have a really hard time with that loss. So, for example, in dementia, there's some losses that are happening on a daily basis, and we cannot necessarily solve that puzzle. So we often feel very helpless in the face of that. We don't like that feeling of ambiguity. Um, but dealing with the ambiguous loss really requires us to acclimate to that ambiguity, which is quite challenging. And I recommend that you get some support if that is something that you are experiencing right now. And ambiguous loss is often not socially recognized, making it disenfranchised, right? That others might say, well, your dad is still alive. I don't know what you're talking about. How could you be grieving him if he's right there? Um, but it also means that caregivers are often grieving multiple losses over a long period of time, which can accumulate. So after all the grief that caregivers will experience during their active caregiving, once the person dies, they're often faced with a new wave of grief. And this is a period that we call the post-caregiving period. So this usually begins after the caregiving has ended. Most of the time, that's due to the death of the person that was being cared for. It can sometimes be because of, a change in circumstances or a change in the role of a caregiver, but most of the time it's because of the death, and that is what our project focuses on. Because what we really see is that caregivers continue to be impacted by their role after the person they were taking care of dies. And unfortunately, in most health and social service systems, once the person dies, the file is closed. There will be one, maybe two phone calls from a worker that was involved in the file to the family to share their condolences. Um, and that's it. And during those first couple days and weeks after the death, usually the family is so, first of all, overwhelmed by what's going on. Second of all, trying to figure out the logistics, planning for a burial, a funeral, contacting the institutions, the legal estates, the different questions that they have to deal with in terms of concrete, instrumental tasks that they need to do. And so usually in those first couple months, they're not even able to start to process all the grief that they've been living. And when it does end up slowly coming to the fore, months later, all the services assigned to them have already usually been closed. And that is when caregivers might need the most support. So for us, we really feel that that post-caregiving period, the days, weeks, months, years after the caregiving role, is really, really important to consider as part of the care trajectory, and that services should be much more available and present for caregivers during that time. So why should we support bereaved caregivers? Why should we care about them even after the person that they were taking care of died? Well, their needs of caregivers do not end with the death of the person they were taking care of. Typically, in our society and in the healthcare systems, there's the assumption made that the caregiving journey has ended, and with it, any of the stress that was faced by the caregivers, right? That now that's it. You don't have to do any of that anymore. You should feel free. But it is an unfortunate reality that many caregivers are faced with a lack of support and services during their end-of-life caregiving as well as their bereavement. And research actually shows us that bereavement of a loved one is experienced differently by caregivers compared to people who are not caregivers. So again, in Australia, they did a research study where they compared the grief quality of life and general health of caregivers with people who were not caregivers, before and after the death of the person that they were taking care of. And what they found was that grief before the death of the person they were taking care of was at 3 to 4 months, the same level as what non-caregivers would experience 3 or 4 months after a death, and that it can take 9 or 10 months post-death for a caregiver's grief quality of life and general health to return to a normative standard. So what this means is that it could take much longer for a caregiver to adjust to the changed reality and to rebuild their life after the death of the person that they were taking care of because of all the losses that they've experienced. So there's multiple losses that really compound themselves, not just the death of the person that was in their life, the relational identity that they had, but also for many caregivers, providing that support to a loved one, no matter what it meant, um, often brings a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose to their life. And from one day to the next, from one moment to the next, that changes and that disappears completely. And it can bring a lot of challenges for them on a personal level in terms of their own identity and sense of meaning. So I like to share this quote from a woman that I had spoken to, and it really stuck with me because she was a mother who had been taking care of her daughter who had Rett syndrome. And essentially, what this meant was that since the daughter was born, um, all of the daily functioning had to be done with medical equipment and it had to be done by somebody else. So the mother had stopped working, she had quit her job, and she spent 21 years just exclusively taking care of her daughter. And her entire life was surrounded around taking care of her daughter. And then when her daughter died, the mother, of course, was absolutely devastated. And she had gone to a general grief support group and she left feeling so angry because she didn't feel understood by the people there who had not been caregivers, who had not had that experience of having to focus so much of their time and energy and love and motivation and everything that they had on taking care of somebody. And she had said the grief is very different because the caregiving was so intense. Every function of her life was our responsibility. Now, of course, it's going to depend on your own situation. It's going to be different based on your situation, but it comes to show us that caregivers have unique triggers and their experience during bereavement really is impacted by their caregiving journey as well. So this slide demonstrates the cartography of factors influencing caregivers' experiences of loss. It is a tool that was developed by Isabelle van Pavenage and some of the other researchers from our Caregiver Grief Connection project, which are Pam Orzek, Zelda Freitas, and Patrick Durivage, social workers. And they had done a literature review of all the research out there to see what are all the factors that can influence the grief experience of a caregiver. Of course, you could see here that there are many different ones. I'm not going to go through each of them, but there was 9 categories that they identified in the end. These categories are factors related to you, the family caregivers, the person that you're taking care of, the circumstances of the death, the relationship between you and the person that you're caring for, your family, your social network, your professional and financial situation, the health and social service environment, and any interactions you've had with them. And then there's also on top of that, some extra factors that are considered complicated grief factors, where these are almost like red flags, where if a healthcare worker sees them, that they should be sure to offer some extra support to the families. There's actually training available for this online in English and in French for healthcare workers on how to use this to identify which supports caregivers will need in their bereavement. But I thought it was helpful to include today so that you can understand yourself all the different things that come into play in your own grief journey and why it becomes so unique to you. Some of the reactions that we hear from bereaved caregivers that they often experience is number one, feeling completely exhausted, completely depleted and drained after months, often years of taking care of somebody. More depression, anxiety, hopelessness, helplessness, social isolation, relief, guilt, anger. These are all very, very common. There are, of course, many more. But what it is that all of these emotions will often be all of these reactions will often be experienced at once and they compound, right? So any grief that's experienced before the death will come to influence the bereavement process as well. And this is another quote from a caregiver who said, I've waited too long to call for services. I'm now off work due to a deep depression. When the doctor gave the diagnosis, I couldn't believe it. I didn't see it coming. I forgot myself. And we see time and again that caregivers spend so much of their energy, their motivation, their time, their money taking care of somebody else. That the first thing in the morning, the first thoughts they have when they wake up is, I need to go prepare the medication for my father. Um, and then from one moment to the next, that's gone, and they have neglected so much of themselves over the years. And in terms of identity, we also see that that really comes to have a big impact. So our personal identities are complex concepts that are impacted by social relationships and experiences. And caregiving often has a huge influence on our sense of identity, on our sense of meaning and purpose and who we are in this world. For some caregivers, especially those who have been doing it for a very long time, that caregiving role becomes the primary driver of their identity. So they often slowly let go of other hobbies, of their goals, of their friendships, of relationships, and many aspects of their lives because they are dedicating so much of themselves to taking care of somebody else. And after the death, that really leaves a void. And it means that there's a complex adaptation to the new routine and the new life without that person and having to reevaluate who they are, their sense of identity and meaning in life. So I'm going to move now into talking about support strategies for caregivers, right? That's what I assume that's what you're here for today. Um, Many of these tips for supporting yourself or somebody through grief are the same as would be relevant for somebody who's not a caregiver, just a general grieving person. So you can keep that in mind if you come across bereaved people in your community. But even more so to be aware of these as a caregiver for yourself or for those that you support. So the very first one is permission to grieve. And this quote says, when we grant ourselves permission to grieve, we make the experience of grief something we recognize, something we welcome into our lives. We allow it to show up the way it wants to through feelings, identities, and actions. We write our own expectations and stories. Our grief becomes ours again, and we become more ourselves again because we actively choose to experience grief. I just want to clarify something here. Permission to grieve does not mean acceptance or approval. Giving yourself permission to grieve doesn't mean I like this and I'm happy to be grieving right now. That is not it at all. It just means that you are recognizing that your experience makes sense in your context, telling yourself that it is normal to feel this way, that you have the right and you have the permission to grieve the losses that you are currently facing. And any future losses as well. So allowing ourselves to witness our own grief doesn't mean we like it, doesn't mean we're happy to be doing it, but it is important for us to be able to move through the grief without letting it restrict us. Now, the next thing is validation. It's important to validate your grief because you cannot fix your grief and you cannot make it disappear. Over the summer, I had spoken to a woman who had been taking care of both her mother and her sister. And unfortunately, they both died within 1 month of each other. And as you can imagine, it was a terrible loss and very, very overwhelming time for this woman. And when she called me, she said, I read 4 books on grief already, and I still don't know what to do. I need you to tell me exactly what to do to stop feeling this way. And I said, I'm so, so sorry. I wish that that is how it worked. I wish that there was a magic formula for grief that I could tell you and that it would work. for everybody across the board and you would feel better. Unfortunately, that's not something that exists. That's not realistic. Um, so we cannot make the grief disappear or fix it, but you can listen to your needs or to the needs of the person grieving, be present and offer compassion. Validating those losses, naming those losses out loud, that this experience that happened is a loss, and acknowledging that the grief may be different for you because of all that you've lived so far. Validating the emotions that come up, reassuring yourself that it is part of the grief experience, normalizing the experience, that it makes sense in this context. So oftentimes people will ask me, is it normal that I feel this way? And I will say, yes. But how would you know if it's normal if you've never spoken to anybody about it? You know, if nobody talks about their grief and shares what they're going through, how are we to know that what we're feeling is normal? That's where the grief literacy comes up in our society and the lack of grief literacy. So normalizing your own experience. And then just a tip for you after, as you know, as you are bereaved, or for the people who are supporting family caregivers, to talk about the person who died. Share about who they were and use the name of the person who died. Most of the time I'll hear, well, I don't want to say the name or bring it up because I don't want to make the person sad. I don't want to remind them. Newsflash, they're already thinking about it. You're not going to remind them. You're not going to make them any sadder by mentioning it. In fact, it helps them to know that that person is remembered, that that person is being honored in daily conversations. So include the person who died in the day-to-day conversations that you have. And if you are the family and friends of somebody who is grieving, ask them, how can I be here for you right now? And if they don't know, because many times they won't know, take the initiative to do something that you know would be helpful. The next one is education, because we really see that having an understanding about grief and learning about it is often a protective factor for bereaved caregivers, that they feel more normalized and that they are able to strip away any myths and misconceptions that they might have on grief that are placing more judgment on themselves for how they think they should be coping. Um, so learning about different grief approaches and theories. There are many, many blog posts out there and different videos that can explain these concepts in a way that are accessible. And there's one model that we really like. It's called the dual process model of grieving. And it essentially means that after a loss, people balance between focusing on the loss and then focusing on rebuilding their lives. And that balance, having both, a bit of both in every single day, is crucial to being able to make it through the grief. So learning about different theories, you can find the ones that resonate most with you. And just knowing that there are no rules to grief. There's no right way to grieve. And if there's any myths that you've heard about stages of grief and expectations of how you should be grieving, revising those by learning about what grief is actually like. So this image shows a circle and it says, people think that grief slowly gets smaller with time. In reality, grief stays the same size, but slowly life begins to grow around it. The next thing that's important to help people through the grief that they're experiencing, especially for caregivers, is finding meaning in your experiences. Creating new rituals and traditions to express yourself and find ways to feel connected with the relationship that you had with the loved one. So I often think of this example of a woman named Lise Cloutier-Steele, who we met at a caregiving conference a couple of years ago. And she had been taking care of her father. And after he died, she wrote a book. The book is called There's No Place Like Home, a guide to helping caregivers manage the long-term care experience. So she wrote a book about her experience to help other caregivers navigate through it. And then with all the proceeds of the book sales, she buys quilts for residents in long-term care. facilities. And this is a way that she honors the memory of her father and her own experience finding meaning in what she went through to help other people. And there's another caregiver that stood out to me because one way was that, um, so this was an older man who had been taking care of his wife, and he used to cook for his wife. And after she died, he lost his appetite and he stopped cooking completely because he felt there was no point in cooking anymore. Um, and after we worked with him through one of our individual support programs, he was able to recognize that cooking for his wife had been a way that he showed his love for her. And so what he did is he slowly started cooking his wife's favorite meals in her honor. And then he would share them with elderly neighbors in their apartment building. And it was a meaningful way for him to maintain that connection that he had with his wife while also helping other people. So finding that meaning is really going to be key in helping caregivers get through the grief process. It's important to find micro moments of joy and celebration. Celebrate yourself and your loved one. You know, there's still joy and life in the day to day, and those holding on to those moments doesn't make you a bad griever, doesn't mean that you are doing anything bad. You can hold those emotions at the same time. Um, and that is very important to do in order to maintain well-being, even in grief. And it's also wonderful to lean on cultural norms and rituals. So every culture has developed ways of coping with grief, and if you feel connected to a certain culture, if there's one that you've grown up with or you feel that it speaks to you, I highly recommend that you lean on the rituals that it provides. So, you know, indigenous ways of knowing and caring have incredible traditions around end of life and rituals to support the entire community. There's some communities that have a 4-day ceremony and people are assigned different roles to watch over the body and to support the family. In Mexican culture, there's the Day of the Dead, which is a really vibrant celebration of the people who died. And then each faith and religion also has beliefs about the afterlife and rituals for grieving. So, for example, in the Jewish religion, there's a really intense 7-day period of mourning. And then there's different commemorations at the 30-day mark, the 11-month mark, 1-year mark, etc. So, cultural norms and rituals can be very beneficial in helping to cope with grief. And of course, they can be adapted to your own context, right? You can pick the ones that mean something to you. Um, and actually, the Canadian Virtual Hospice has a really, really good website called livingmyculture.ca, where they interviewed people from 11 different cultures about end-of-life care, death, and grief. And it's short clips, like 2-minute long clips or shorter. And it's really fascinating to see how the different cultures experience death. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend seeing that website about different cultures. It's called livingmyculture.ca. Another way to help people express their grief is creativity. And we highly recommend using creativity to express your grief in whichever way, whichever means makes sense for you. So if that's drawing, painting, poetry, writing, music, dance, sculpture, making a recipe book, a scrapbook, a photo album, anything really that comes easily to you to express what you're going through. So and allowing yourself to use imagery and metaphors to express that grief. Um, this picture here is of a sculpture called Melancholy by Albert Giorgi that is in Geneva in Switzerland, and he created it after the death of his wife when he felt a really intense sorrow and he wanted to represent the void that he felt after her death. But in creating this sculpture, he was able to have other people connect to that experience as well, and it really resonated. So, using creativity to help express what you have lived through can not only help you get through, but also make the experience feel more human for others. I'm going to talk a little bit about stories and reframing our stories because the story of how we the story that we tell ourselves about our caregiving journeys or about our grief really make a difference in how we live in this world. And so Pam Orzek, who is one of the founders of Caregiver Grief Connection, had worked on this tool called a careography, which is a visual timeline to represent the care-related biography of caregivers during the care trajectory. Um, and essentially what it is just drawing out on a timeline all the events that have happened for the person that was being cared for and also for yourself as a caregiver and seeing how they connect. And often when this is done after the death of the person that was being cared for, but it can also be done before, it can help somebody make sense of what they have lived through and make links between, oh, I didn't realize that it was after the hospitalization of my mom that I started to have more anxiety about this. There are some things that we might not make links, even though they might seem obvious to others, because we're so caught up in the day-to-day of the routines. So writing it out, whether it's this kind of timeline or journaling or writing out a story, can really help us do like a review, a life review, and see how we can reframe some of our stories that maybe we did the best that we could, and that our grief is not bad and we are not alone, and that the process takes time. And so art as well, if it's through art, can be very beneficial. This image here on the left-hand side is from a series of short videos. Currently, they're only available in French, unfortunately, even though I'm advocating for them to be available in English. And it's called Le Deuil Animé by François Rainville, where it essentially illustrates grief as a big ocean that we often feel overwhelmed by, and the waves are crashing down, and we feel that we don't know that we're drowning or that we are just barely trying to survive. So there are many different illustrations of grief. You can find lots of videos and stories written out there, blog posts that speak to that kind of experience. And if you're able to create for yourself, it can be beneficial as well. So caregiving is a very isolating experience because we end up focusing so much time and energy on one person. Um, so caregiving is very isolating, and then grief calls us to further isolate ourselves to protect ourselves from the overwhelming nature of the emotions that we're experiencing, which just leads to people being extremely isolated and lonely in their caregiving experiences. But connection really is a healing factor. So as I was saying earlier, that education is a protective factor, but so is connection as well. Because as humans, we have a key need for our grief to be witnessed, to be validated, and to be understood. So we always, always recommend connecting either with other people, with other humans, but if it's hard to do that, connecting with nature, with a special place in nature, whether it's a forest or a body of water or a specific location. So connecting with nature or animals, right? Pets, if you have any pets, or any ways that you're able to connect with animals as well, or just peaceful experiences. Those are all ways that you can still get a sense of connection, even if it's not with another human being. Of course, the best is to be able to have your experience be heard and validated from another human who has gone through it and has some compassion. Um, and so identifying those sources of support and resilience and leaning on them is really important to be able to heal through grief. You can create a circle of care and with both the formal and informal supports that you have. And there is a toolkit from the Pallium Atlas Care Map toolkit they have workshops, and it's all for free online if you search Pallium Atlas Care Map toolkit to help you illustrate all the different sources of support that you have. And most often what people realize is that once they start to name them and to really, really think about them, they identify more sources of support than they initially would have thought of. Um, And so we recommend that you lean on those. That is what community is about. Now, the next two require a little bit of courage, but if you know that a sensitive milestone is coming up, if you know there's an anniversary, there's a birthday, there's a holiday that's coming up, and you're a little bit nervous about getting through it alone, try to ask for support from someone that you trust who is non-judgmental, who can check in on you. And on the flip side, if you're a healthcare worker or a frontline worker and you know there's somebody who is going through a vulnerable time, make an effort to check in on them a little bit more. Um, and for family caregivers, reach out for help. There are resources for individual and group support for caregivers. There's also grief support for caregivers. You can contact Family Caregivers of BC. I've listed some of the numbers in the resource slide soon. So finally, I recommend patience. Patience with the process, patience towards yourself and with others. And this quote really well depicts the experience of grief. And it says, in fact, every pronounced feeling in grief usually requires repetition to eventually soften and become reconciled. Grief is not even a two steps forward, one step back kind of dance. Instead, it is often one step forward, two steps in a circle, and one step sideways. It takes a lot of time, patience, and yes, backward motion before forward motion starts to predominate. So be patient with yourself. We also often suggest if there's any big decisions that you're trying to make that don't need to be made right now, postpone them. You know, if you're having a hard time remembering things because there's just too much going on, write down the things that are important and just try to take it one moment at a time right now. And then, of course, this is advice you'll hear from any medical professional ever, no matter what you're going through. But it's always good to find and maintain a routine for stability, especially around things like basic needs like your sleep, nutrition, hygiene, and exercise, which is always easier said than done. I'll quickly go over some of the resources here. So Family Caregivers of BC, Caregivers has lots of caregiver support groups and lots of information online. I highly recommend that you check out their website. And the BC Bereavement Helpline has tons of different grief support groups. So you can see which ones are available in your area. If you are not in BC, as I am not in BC, but you can also check with your local caregiver organizations. And if you really can't find anything, you can reach out to us and we'll try to do some research to see what's available in your area. Canadian Virtual Hospice and mygrief.ca have tons of online accessible modules on all types of grief. So this is really good for learning about grief, different kinds of relationship, different grief experiences. They're all online for free. You could do them at your own pace. You could start up again 3 months later. It's all there. The Pallium Atlas Care Map is a good resource as well. And then there's a couple other links, including our website, which is caregivergrief.com. So I want to say thank you very much to Family Caregivers of BC and to all of you for being here today. I know we didn't leave a ton of time for questions, but if you have any questions, presentations, consultations, anything, feel free to email us at info@caregivergrief.com. You can check out our website, or you can also follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn to see the upcoming events that we have. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Um, we had a good kind of number of people sharing things here and some questions that they had. I think we have just a couple of minutes here
Mhm.
of questions that we can provide. So one person, sorry, I'm just trying to find that question. So one person was just asking about passive resignation.
Mhm.
Just kind of wanted um, us to touch on it, the definition and provide an example. Um, do you want to take that on, or would you like me to take that on?
Well, is it passive resignation as you're actively caregiving and you just don't have the energy to think about grief right now? Is that the kind of passive resignation?
Um, I think it could be anything.
Can that?
They didn't specify if it's before or after,
Okay.
um, but just in general, I guess, that it exists and what it is.
Yes. Yes. Well, we do often come across caregivers who'll say, this is all nice to hear, but well, not even really nice to hear. But I'm just so overwhelmed with what I have to do on a day-to-day basis that I don't even have the capacity to start to process my grief right now. I'm just doing what I need to do on a daily basis to survive. And that is absolutely normal. That is very, very common in the grief or in the caregiving journey. And that's okay. It's okay if you need to compartmentalize your grief into a little box, put it aside in the corner, and only take it out later when you have the time or when you feel that you have the energy to face that. That's perfectly understandable and normal. And you don't need to feel guilty that you're also not taking on the energy to process this grief. You need to do what you need to do to get through the days, and we completely understand and recognize that.
For those of you who may not know what passive resignation is, to put it simply, it's basically when a person begins to feel like nothing they do will make a difference.
Mm,
So, they may stop trying to change things or ask for help because they feel tired or discouraged or powerless. And it usually comes after a long time of caring and worrying and carrying this heavy load of
yeah,
responsibilities to the point where your body and mind can just become very torn down. So, as Rebecca said, like certain things come to mind, like, what's the point anymore? Or nothing I do will change this. Or I just need to get through the day because you don't have time to stop and think and process. And so, um, I hope that kind of helps shed some light and answer that question a little bit. And then someone else asked about if we can comment on if it's normal to express frustrations, so usually coming from burnout, when loved one was still alive and feelings of guilt come after they're gone.
absolutely. And most of the time, if people feel frustrations while the person is still alive, they'll often feel that guilt even while the person is still alive. The guilt shows up actively during the caregiving role and after the person dies as well. It's completely normal. Um, and it comes down to, feelings of judgment of what we should be doing, the type of caregiver we should be, how we should be acting um, in this world, or the expectations that we feel others are placing on us, but also frustrations with how the situation is going, with the lack of support from our families, from our friends, from the healthcare system. There's so many things that come into play that make it normal to be frustrated as you're going through the caregiving journey and even after the person dies. And the guilt is ever present. It is something that we often have to work with caregivers on, and it can take quite a while to work on that guilt and recognizing that you are also doing the best that you can right now in this situation. And part of it is the human experience, right? You're not an all-powerful being. If you were, you would have changed the situation so it was nothing like this to begin with, but you're not. And recognizing your own limits, not as limits, but just as facts of the situation, and giving yourself compassion is very important for dealing with the frustrations and the guilt.
Thank you. There are so many more questions coming in, and I'm so happy that you all have questions and you're engaged. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we would love to hear from you. So if you'd like to email your questions, we'd love to be able to get back to you on that. Just before we go, I just wanted to just make sure I share this. Also share FCBC's information as well. So this is just our website as well as our BC Caregiver support line. We're available Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 4 to answer any questions you have, to listen to you and walk with you alongside you in the experiences that you are facing. So as we conclude this very insightful presentation. I just want to extend my gratitude to Rebecca. Thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, for coming and sharing your knowledge. I think it's so important, allowing space to understand and accept grief. It can be such an important step in supporting ourselves and others through loss. And I hope everyone here that joined us today is able to take away at least one new idea or reflection or resource that'll help support you in your caregiving journey. Before you all go, I just want to mention that we will be posting the recording of this webinar on our website. So I'll be reaching out to you via email with the slides attached, with the link to the recording, as well as a link to a feedback survey that I'll also add here in the chat as well. We really value your feedback and your insights to help us improve our webinars, as well as to know what topics you would like to learn more about in the future. So with that being said, thank you all for attending, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so
Take
much.
care, everyone.